Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to take a step back and paint with kind of a broad brush to look at how the governments of the colonies grew in similar ways and how some of the conflicts that they faced were also similar. So, your objectives for today: process, copy, do what you need to do. And without further ado, let's dive in. So, most of the colonies had developed some sort of a democratic governmental structure, very similar in a lot of ways to the government of England. In the colonies, the king would appoint a royal governor who would rule similar to how a king would, have veto power and both legislative and executive power, and could also, of course, oversee trade. And the royal governor would appoint his own council to help him rule, similar to a cabinet. And then, of course, the colonial assembly would be elected by leading voters. They, of course, would have the authority to tax, and they'd pay the governor's salary, and they would make laws, but the laws could be vetoed by the governor. And so you've got some elements of democracy here. You've also got some separation of powers. And each colony, for the most part, operated like a miniature England, with an executive who was not responsive to the colonists, but a colonial assembly that was. Of course, keep in mind, all of the colonies had property requirements for voting, so it was only wealthy people who were able to vote, and of course, not women. But there was some level of democracy and responsiveness. Although all colonies had property requirements, there was a significant number of small landowning farmers who could vote and participate in politics, especially in places like New England and Pennsylvania. In the South, a lot of these yeoman farmers would not hit the property requirement, but a significant portion of white American men could. And so whereas in England, the franchise was pretty strictly restricted based on that property requirement, in the colonies, a larger percentage of people could own property and could vote. And so there was this aristocracy and these social classes. And then, of course, we always have to remember slaves who had no rights and Native Americans who had no rights. But there was a significant portion of the male population that did have more representation than would have been in most European countries. Because of this vast array of small farmers who could vote, we get the idea of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is the idea that women need to be educated so they can educate their sons and daughters. Their sons need to be educated so when they grow up, they can vote intelligently. And their daughters need to grow up so if they have sons later, they can educate them. It's not a huge step forward in women's rights. I mean, it is, and it isn't. Like most of these developments pushing for more people to have rights, it is a step forward, but a slow step forward. Legislative power was for the most part held again by the wealthy. Although most people could vote, most of the people who could actually go and serve in these assemblies were wealthy. And over time, more and more power started to flow to large landowning farmers. And so, for example, in the middle colonies, of course, the southern colonies, you've got your large plantation owners who hold most of the legislative power. But in the middle colonies, you started to get the same thing as wealthy farmers along the Hudson River and along the Delaware River in Pennsylvania would eventually start to get more political power and would then hold the power of redistricting. And despite the fact that most people could vote, only a few were actually represented in government. One of the big blows to colonial government England made a couple attempts to reestablish a more direct control over colonial government. For example, the Dominion of New England was an attempt by King James to exert more power over New England specifically and New York. This was, of course, after a number of incidents like King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion, and in the midst of some of the witch trials. And so King James appointed Edmund Andros to be the governor of the Dominion of New England, which was basically a super colony, which they hoped could then control some of the smuggling and consolidate more power and give the king more of a role in colonial authority. So here's your super colony. Obviously, the colonists were not thrilled about this. They had been running their own affairs for more than a generation now, and the king tried to re-exert power over the colonies and basically cut their elected assemblies out of the loop was not appreciated. And Leisler's rebellion was a man named Jacob Leisler seizing control and kicking out the current royal governor. And although the rebellion failed, it did demonstrate to the king exactly how much resistance he would get from the Dominion of New England, and the Dominion never actually went into effect. So Leisler is executed for treason, but the Dominion of New England never happened, and when the Glorious Revolution occurred a couple years later, William and Mary continued to let the colonies do more or less whatever they wanted. The Zenger Trial is another example of the colonies exerting their own authority. This is the trial of a newspaper editor, John Peter Zenger, who was arrested for printing negative things about the governor of New York. And the jury ended up ruling that he was not guilty of libel because the things that he was printing were true. And so this is the beginning of the idea of freedom of the press. And it's going to be one of the rights that is going to be enshrined in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So the Zenger trial represents another step towards some of the principles that we consider essential in American democracy. Over time, increasing settlement led to other tensions. Obviously, Maine up here was part of Massachusetts Bay, and as more Puritans started coming in, the borders between Canada and the colonies started to be stretched. Colonists also started moving westward, and so Massachusetts, most of the colonial charters basically just said that their borders went all the way to the ocean. And so what we start getting is conflicts between colonies like Boston and New York and Pennsylvania over what territory is owned by what colony, and to how far and how the extent to which these colonies can spread westward. So here we see the colonial population growth picking up pretty substantially. And the cities start to grow larger, which of course creates their own series of infrastructural problems. And more people start moving out into the backcountry, pushing up against the Appalachian Mountains, which of course creates problems with Native American tribes there. And so we start seeing another round of conflict brewing as Europeans encroach more intensely on Native American lands. And we start to see this divide between people who have land and people who don't, because the Appalachian Mountains represent a physical barrier in a lot of senses. And so the colonies are running out of land to give to second and third sons and new immigrants. And so we start seeing a rising class of tenant farmers who are now simply renting their land from larger landowners, which is fine in that they have some land that they can farm and survive, but it's difficult in that they don't have political rights. And so we start to see a larger degree of social stratification, especially in places like New York, where the number of tenant farmers was growing substantially. This led to something called the Regulator Movement, which was a union between small farmers and tenant farmers to attempt to get more political power and to cut down on voting requirements. The regulators are sometimes pitched as a proto-revolutionary movement, which I guess kind of, but not really. They were angry at the colonial governments and specifically the colonial elites on the coast. And so they would go around creating problems until militias would come and the regulators were crushed. But it is important to note that the regulator movement was indicative of growing social tensions between coastal elites and poorer farmers on the interior. So the question of who does the government actually represent? Does it represent the wealthy elites who have enough money and time to go and sit in the legislature? Or does it represent all of the citizens? Or does it represent all of the people within the colony? Which, of course, at this point, that would be an incredibly radical idea and would probably not fly. So here are your objectives. Hopefully you can come up with substantive answers to these questions. And we'll come back next time to further talk about some of the divides and to bring slavery back to the forefront.